Somewhere beneath the palace of Crete, there was a maze built so cleverly that no one who entered it ever found their own way back out. Somewhere inside that maze lived something that was never quite a man and never quite a monster, waiting in the dark for the next tribute to arrive, and once every 9 years, 14 young Athenians walked into it knowing exactly what waited for them and knowing they weren't coming back. This is the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. If you enjoy stories like this one, just like Troy here does, hi Troy, consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so the next one finds you the moment it's ready. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back to a king named Minos, ruler of Crete, and a bargain he never should have broken. Poseidon, god of the sea, sent Minos a magnificent white bull as a gift, rising straight out of the ocean onto the shore in front of the whole royal court, with one condition attached: sacrifice it in the god's honour. The bull was simply too beautiful to give up. Its coat caught the light like polished marble, and Minos, standing there admiring it, decided almost on the spot that he'd rather keep it for himself. He sent a lesser animal to the altar in its place, thinking, the way kings often think, that no one important enough to matter would ever notice the difference. Poseidon noticed, and his punishment wasn't aimed at Minos directly. It landed instead on Minos's wife, Pasiphae, cursed with an affliction so unnatural that what followed changed the entire family forever. What came of it was a child unlike anything that had ever been born before. A boy with the body of a man and the head of a bull, growing larger and more dangerous with every passing year. His temperament, nothing like a child should be, until it became clear he could never simply live among the rest of the household the way an ordinary son would. Minos turned to Daedalus, the most brilliant craftsman in the known world, a man capable of building nearly anything asked of him, and gave him an impossible task: build something that could hold the creature forever, something no strength or cleverness could ever undo. Daedalus designed a labyrinth beneath the palace, like a maze so intricate, so deliberately confusing, corridor folding into corridor with no visible pattern at all, that once you stepped past its entrance, finding your way back out again was almost never possible. Even Daedalus himself, some say, had to think carefully before he could trust his own way through it, tracing the walls with his fingers the way you'd read a language only he understood. Into that maze Minos placed the Minotaur, and sealed the entrance behind him, leaving the creature alone in the dark with nothing but stone corridors stretching out in every direction. Years passed. Minos' own son travelled to Athens to compete in a series of games, and died there. Some say through treachery, some say by simple misfortune. But Minos believed the worst, and grief turned quickly and completely into fury. He gathered his fleet, dozens of ships crowding the horizon off the coast of Athens, and laid siege to the city until it had no food left to feed itself, no choice left but to surrender to whatever terms Minos demanded of them. The terms were merciless. Every 9 years, Athens would send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete, 14 of the city's own children chosen by lottery, with no wealth or status able to buy their way out of it, to be led into the labyrinth and left there for the Minotaur. No weapon, no warning, no guide. Just the maze, the dark, and whatever waited somewhere inside it, patient and hungry. Twice already, the harbour had filled with grieving families on the morning the ship departed, mothers and fathers watching black sails disappear over the horizon, carrying children they already knew deep down they would never see again. Twice already none of the 14 had ever come home, and the entire city had learned to dread the arrival of the next lottery. The way you dread a storm you can already see gathering on the horizon. Far from Crete, in a small coastal town, a boy named Theseus grew up not fully understanding who his father was. His mother, Aethra, had been visited the same night by two different men, King Aegeus of Athens and Poseidon himself, god of the sea, leaving Theseus with both a mortal claim to a throne and a divine strength that showed itself early, long before anyone around him could fully explain where it came from. Before Aegeus left Aethra's side that night, he'd hidden a sword and a pair of sandals beneath an enormous boulder, one far too heavy for any ordinary man to move, and told her that when their son grew strong enough to lift that stone on his own, he should take what was hidden underneath and come find him in Athens. Theseus grew into that strength exactly the way his father hoped he would. The day he finally set his shoulder against the boulder and rolled it aside, finding the sword and, sandals waiting beneath it. He didn't take the easy road to Athens by sea, the safe route nearly every other traveller chose. He walked the dangerous overland route instead, the one most people avoided entirely, thick with bandits, who'd made a home out of preying on anyone foolish enough to pass through. Along that road he crossed paths with men who'd terrorised travellers for years. Men who'd never once met anyone strong enough to actually stop them. Men who'd built entire cruel routines around the suffering of whoever crossed their path. Theseus ended every single one of those routines the same way they'd been run against countless others, turning each bandit's own methods back against them. By the time he finally reached Athens, dusty and travel-worn, his name had already outrun him, carried ahead by every grateful traveller he'd saved along the way. He arrived in his father's city just as the lottery for the next tribute to Crete was being drawn. The whole city gathered somberly in the square, watching names get pulled, while trying not to hope too hard that their own child's name wouldn't be among them. When Theseus learned what that tribute actually meant, 14 young people sent every 9 years into a maze to die for a debt they'd never had any part in creating, he made a decision his father begged him not to make. He volunteered to go himself as one of the 14, determined to kill the Minotaur himself and end the tribute for good. Aegeus couldn't talk him out of it, no matter how he pleaded. All he could do in the end was ask for one thing in return. The ship carrying the tribute always sailed under black sails, the colour of mourning, since no one ever expected it to return with good news. Aegeus asked Theseus to change them to white on the voyage home, if he survived, so his father would know the moment the ship came into view, long before it ever reached the harbour, that his son was still alive when the ship carrying Theseus and the other 13 young Athenians reached Crete. Minos's own daughter, Ariadne, happened to be standing at the harbour to watch them arrive, the way she'd watched every tribute ship arrive before this one. But something about Theseus was different, and whatever she felt looking at him in that moment was immediate and complete, strong enough that she went to Daedalus, in secret that same night, and asked him the one thing that could actually save a life inside his own labyrinth. Daedalus told her a simple truth, the kind of truth that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The maze wasn't unbeatable because of its walls, its dead ends, or its endless doubling corridors. It was unbeatable because no one who entered it ever had any way of finding their way back out again. A thread unspooled from the entrance and carried the whole way through would solve that problem completely. Ariadne found Theseus before he was led down into the dark and pressed a ball of thread into his hands, along with everything Daedalus had told her, speaking quickly and quietly so no one else would overhear. In exchange, she asked for exactly one thing: that if he survived, he would take her with him when he sailed home, away from a father who had just spent 9 years sending children to die for his own broken promise to a god. Theseus agreed without hesitation. He tied one end of the thread just inside the labyrinth's entrance, feeling the weight of the whole spool in his palm, and began walking into the dark, unspooling it behind him one careful step at a time, deeper into a maze built specifically so that no one who entered it would ever find their way out on their own. The passages twisted in on themselves constantly, doubling back, narrowing until his shoulders nearly brushed both walls at once, then opening suddenly into wider chambers that gave no clue which direction led forward and which led only back the way he'd already come. The air grew colder the deeper he went, and the silence pressed in around him, broken only by his own footsteps and, somewhere far off, a low, uneven sound he couldn't quite place at first. Theseus kept the thread taut behind him the entire way, his only real guarantee that any of this would ever end, his fingers never once letting it go slack. Somewhere deep inside that maze, he finally found what he'd come for: the Minotaur, massive and powerful, its bull's head lowering as it caught his scent, backed into a chamber it had likely called home for its entire miserable existence, having never once known anything except these same stone walls and whatever the maze delivered to it every 9 years, exactly like clockwork. The fight that followed was brutal and close, fought in near total darkness with nothing but instinct, desperation, and the memory of everything he'd learned on the road to Athens carrying him through it. Theseus fought not with hatred exactly. How could you truly hate something that had never once been given a choice in what it became? But with the same grim, focused determination that had gotten him this far. When it finally ended, the Minotaur lay still on the stone floor of the chamber it had never once been allowed to leave in its entire life. Theseus turned back the way he'd come, following the thread hand over hand through passage after passage, retracing every twist and turn without a single wrong step, and found daylight again exactly where he'd left it, waiting at the entrance along with Ariadne and the 13 other Athenians he'd just saved from a fate that had already claimed 28 before them. They fled Crete together that same night, Ariadne included, sailing quietly out of the harbour before Minos could learn what had actually happened inside his own labyrinth. They stopped along the way at the island of Naxos to rest, exhausted from the crossing. And it was there, while Ariadne slept on the sand beneath an unfamiliar sky, that Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, appeared to Theseus and made his intentions unmistakably clear. He had chosen Ariadne for himself, and Theseus was to leave her behind on the island rather than carry her the rest of the way home to Athens. Theseus sailed on without her. When Ariadne woke alone on Naxos, watching his ship already small and distant on the horizon, it must have felt like the cruelest possible ending to everything she'd risked to help him. But her story doesn't end in abandonment the way it might seem to in that terrible moment. Dionysus came to her there and made her his bride, not a mortal wife destined to grow old and fade the way mortal wives do, but something closer to an equal, elevated into a figure the god himself would honour for the rest of time. What began as a betrayal became, in its own strange way, something far larger than the ordinary life she'd have had waiting for her back in Athens. Theseus, meanwhile, sailed on toward home, consumed by grief over what he'd just been forced to do, and in that grief he forgot the one promise that mattered most to the one person waiting for his return. The black sails stayed exactly as they'd been the entire voyage out, and he never once thought to look up and check. King Aegeus had spent every single day since his son's departure standing on a cliff above the sea, watching the horizon for the first glimpse of the returning ship's sails. When it finally appeared, still distant, still difficult to make out clearly against the morning haze, he strained to see the colour that would tell him whether his son was alive or lost. He saw black canvas rather than white, and in that instant, believing completely that his son was gone, Aegeus threw himself from the cliff into the sea below rather than face a life and a city without him. The waters have carried his name ever since, the Aegean Sea, named for a father whose grief arrived just moments before the truth would have finally reached him. Theseus returned to Athens a hero, having ended 9 years of tribute and killed a creature that had terrorized his city since before he was even born. He became king in his father's place and went on by most accounts to rule wisely and well for the rest of his long life, remembered as one of Athens' greatest kings. But the victory that made him a legend arrived shadowed by 2 losses he never fully accounted for. A woman left sleeping on a distant island, and a father who died believing the worst moments before he would have finally learned the truth waiting just over the horizon. Perhaps that's the part of this story worth sitting with longest. Theseus solved the labyrinth. He killed the monster no one else had ever managed to kill. And still, in the end, the thing that actually changed everything wasn't the maze at all, and it wasn't the Minotaur either. It was a single detail he simply forgot on a ship sailing home to the people who loved him most. If you enjoy stories like this one, subscribe to Mythology and Legends and turn on the notification bell so the next one finds you the moment it's ready. Which myth would you like told next? Leave it in the comments below. Thank you for listening to the tale of Theseus and the Minotaur, and we'll see you again soon.